Hi all, our notable game today is another game from the great legend of chess, James Fischer, also known as Bobby Fischer. His opponent here was Maximilian Blau. This is in the Varna Olympiad of 1962. Maximilian Blau, for those interested, was born in Munich, Germany. He was awarded the IM title in 1953. He was Swiss champion in 1953, 55, 56 and 1967. He played for Switzerland in all Olympiads from 1952 to 1968. And his best tournament result was first at Lausanne 1949. So a Swiss champion here, Switzerland champion. E4. And Fischer with black played the Sicilian Defense. This is going to be a fighting game. Knight F3, D6, we enter into C takes, and here actually, although the most common move is knight takes d4, the second most popular in my book is queen takes d4. And you might think, doesn't this violate beginners rules about bringing the queen out too early? Is there a tempo game to be had? Well, this tempo game weakens d5, and this one, which is the most popular move, it can be pinned. So white's not having to lose the tempo of the queen necessarily, but might have to give up the light square bishop here. Bishop d7, unpinning, threatening knight takes queen. White takes, bishop takes, and the most popular move actually here is to play knight c3. There's about nearly 1500 games in this line. Carries on a bit like this. It's an interesting line, which should be roughly equal. It's quite dangerous, this position, for black. If black doesn't know what he's doing, this is quite dangerous. He or she needs to know how to generate counterplay. So this is a typical continuation like this. But in this game, we see actually slightly rarer c4, which is also quite popular, setting up Morocco bind. So white has given up his light square bishop and set up the bind, so the bishop is not a kind of prisoner in the pawn chain here. Knight f6, immediate pressure on e4. Knight c3, protecting e4. g6, preparing to fianchetto. And white played bishop g5 here. Quite often just castling is played like this, with the queen going to d3. This is quite often played as well. So bishop g5 immediately. Bishop g7. And white often just castles here. In this game, quite a more forcing looking move is played, quite aggressive looking. White's casting there's 8 games in my book like this, where the queen just steps back here, and we see white trying to keep this bind on the position. And if the bishop's kicked, fine, it will go there, and it's supposed to be okay. But here we see in this game quite an aggressive move from white, but is it that effective? Sometimes you can get an aggressive looking move which isn't that actually effective. Knight d5, okay, it's using the temporary pin on the g7 bishop, but black just castles. Queen d3, and it does give black now the option, the fairly pleasant option, of being able to take on d5 if he wants. And Fischer does indeed take on d5 here, and we see e takes d5, which, although yes, the e file later might be good for e7, it does leave white with a potentially exposed pawn, this c4 pawn. We see now knight d7, which looks at the b2 pawn. Engine's suggestion here is actually to play a check, which is interesting, for queen a6. So you see that c pawn is pinned here, and this is quite a good position for black. If black can cripple white's pawn structure, as this variation advertises, then this is great stuff for black. This is a nice position for black. Beautiful blockade. Double pawns. Yes, that's quite a nice continuation with queen a5 check here for this nifty maneuver. But this is interesting as well. Knight d7. Queen d2, which protects the pawn and stops queen a5 check. Rook c8 hitting the pawn. Rook c1. And the point here, which Fischer must have had in mind, very, very aggressive move. Can you guess what black plays in this position if I give you 5 seconds starting from now to pause the video. Okay, b5, yes, he hits that c4 pawn, and white humbly protects it. If white takes, rook takes, queen takes, the check actually comes in handy here, and for a reason you might not be immediately obvious, on knight d2, this position here, not taking on b5, which would seem superficially quite attractive, but there's a sting in the tail here. White now has queen c6, and that's okay for white. No, instead, h6. If bishop takes, then there's rook e8 with the pin. Bishop moves back, and ignoring b5, but actually taking on a2, which hits d5. And this is nice for black, this position, if he can take this pawn. Next, nice for black. White can't really do much about d5 here. If queen c4, then there's a check here, which is winning material basically, and embarrassing. So yeah, this is a very energetic, logical move by Fischer, this b5, very dangerous. So black is causing white into another defensive move, but it leaves a backward pawn now. B takes is played. Knight c5, so first there's a blockade set up on c5, and what instructive measures will be taken against this c-pawn here? Well, the first thing actually Fischer does is use the fork possibility, knight e4, in this position to get the dark square bishop. Now you might think, hold on, couldn't white have just parried that on the previous move? If white plays something like queen c2, actually there's a problem in this position with the bishop stuck out here. This bishop's got a very nice diagonal, and black has a very nice move in this position, which would get an advantage here. Can you see what black could play in this position if I give you 5 seconds, starting from now? Yeah, rook b8. It's dangerous here. With the king stuck in the centre, white really can't do much of significance against rook b2 without allowing horrible checks in some variations. And there's also this knight d3 lurking around, potentially. So this would be unpleasant. If rook b2 has to be tolerated, it picks up the a2 pawn. Black's doing great. So yeah, this unfortunate fork is a side effect of the bishop being stuck on g5. So white castles, knight e4, queen e3. So black picks up that dark square bishop, and in this position now plays rook c5. So blockading again. White hasn't yet got any knight maneuver. d4 is covered by this beautiful bishop. Queen e3, as though knight d4 to c6 is on the cards. Queen c7. And in response to this, white ignores this c4 pressure by playing knight d4. So he's actually banking, it seems, on knight c6 here. So if rook takes c4, there is the idea of knight c6, and white might have some compensation here for the pawn. Let's have a quick check on this position. Yeah, apparently white's this is the idea, and apparently white should be having some compensation. In fact, instead of recapturing here, knight takes e7 check, and rook takes c1 is afforded by the position. They should be about equal. So in the light of this, Fischer wants to avoid that continuation, that version of events. So guess what black plays here? If I give you 5 seconds starting from now to pause the video. Okay, simple clarity. Bishop takes d4. Yes, give up the lovely dark square bishop. But there's a reason, yeah, to stop that knight c6. And build up more now, trebling against the poor c4 pawn, the backward pawn being tortured. And after rook c2, it looks as though the pawn, in taking it, isn't this pawn going to drop off? But the thing is, it's about blowing up the centre here. This is a common theme in many hypermodern openings with black, that the centre can be blown up at some point. And here d5 is going to be weaker. So rook takes, we see queen takes a7, hitting e7 though. There's no time to take on d5. So what does Fischer do here? Another great move, powerful move. Black is in the driving seat here, but what does Black need to play? A very, very good move is played by Fischer. If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video here, starting from now. Okay, queen e4. It protects e7. It keeps the pressure on e4, and it supports either rook c5 or rook c4. We see h3 because the back row giving some air to the king. So luft. Rook c4 threatens not just rook d4 for d5, but also rook a4, forking the queen and the a2 pawn. Rook d1. And here there might be an annoying check on b8 for rook a4. So we see this king g1 first, avoiding the checks. Queen b7 is played. And there might be a check on this diagonal now in response to rook a4. So actually we see queen e2 stopping any queen b2 check, hitting the rook. The rook tucks next to the king, protected by the king at least. But here rook a4. So Black is not only covering e7, he's covering b2 simultaneously. And he's putting the pressure not on d5, but it seems a2 is the more exploitable target here to get something without losing something, basically. Because if he had gone for d5 in those lines, he'd be losing something here. It's without compromise the a2 pawn. We see the move queen b3 here. You might think, hold on a sec, couldn't White have defended a2? If instead of queen b3, rook a1 was played, there's actually a great move here for Black. The most clinical move, can you guess if I give you 5 seconds here? Okay, again, you don't want to drop e7 at any point. So by taking, you might actually drop e7. In fact, queen e5 keeps an eye on e7, hits the rook. And this is going to be winning a pawn very, very safely. So rook d1, rook takes a2. Or if the queen had gone back, then we just take on d5. If the queen goes back here, I think we just safely take on d5. So it's a way of safely taking a pawn. So instead, queen b3, consigning officially now to the first loss of a pawn. Rook takes a2. Is it going to be technique? Check. We see f6 in this position. There might be some nuisance checks on c8 and c3 reverberating, or c1 if the king goes there at the moment. We see queen e1, and the black queen just steps back here instead of taking. This seems to be more precise actually. Fischer's move is more precise because this could be a little bit annoying, this position here, where anytime e5 is played there's going to be takes and the pawns are fractured a little bit. But it's still obviously better for black now. f4, which weakens the second rank. And Fischer actually takes here on d5. This is interesting. He doesn't mind his king being exposed to a few checks. Some calculation here is shown. But he could also consider check and king f8 to defend. That avoids queen e6 check. This is an engine line where queen d2. This position should be very nice for black as well. But yeah, we see this very interesting. Queen takes d5, allowing the check. King h6 and allowing the check here. And the king is driven up the board a little bit. Some players might find this a little bit scary, but there's nothing much in support of the queen here. We see g4 check, king h4. Black now threatens, of course, queen g2 mate. Check, taking the pawn with check. King takes h3, threatening the mate again. So the check. But now king takes g4. So now officially black is 2 pawns up. Check. And here king h4. And now white is running out of checks. He throws in another check at move 40. King h5. And really there's no immediately obvious check here because there's no check which is any good here. g5 is covered by the queen. We'll just lose another pawn. So white gave up in this position. He's also got major king safety issues now. His king's got no defense. If we just have a look at this position for a moment. If rook f2, this is a forced mate in 5. Check, check, check. And we've got rook a1 check here. Yeah, the white king hasn't got any king safety, so that could have been a continuation there as an example. So yeah, after king h5, that's kind of the end of things. Now, I thought this was quite an interesting game, and I hope you've got something from it. The things that I will take from this game is, first of all, Fischer hasn't got a complete bias to keeping his dark square bishop. If there's a specific issue in the position, a knight coming to c6, he considers taking off that knight, creating some theoretically weaker dark squares around his king, but keeping things simple with the backward c pawn. Now, it seems initially taking out the pawn chain, you want to immediately, when you undermine the pawn chain at the base, tap into the rich pickings after the d5 pawn. But in fact, Fischer showed great care and precision and patience here not to immediately go for d5 when his e7 pawn or checks were at risk. Instead, the more easily exploitable without any downsides pawn was victimized, the a2 pawn, and only later the d5 pawn. So patience can reduce the double-edgedness. So in conclusion, in a nutshell, the game shows when Fischer has an advantage, he has his cake and he eats it. In other words, he doesn't allow checks, he doesn't allow the opponent to get any pawns. If there does seem to be a logical consequence, which most club players we look forward to, the d5 pawn, he's very careful, he takes his time to make sure there's no downsides. And in fact, going to a2 here I think was particularly instructive, and the way he took over the centre with his major pieces. The calculation in the end showed, it was safe to do what he did with the king. He's picking up now 2 pawns, and white's king safety is also shot to pieces in the final position. So I think quite an instructive game, a meat and potatoes instructive game. Hope you got something from it. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.